Now, Indy Johar, a round of applause for him. It's so nice to have you here with us, Indy. We have been talking about love and food and trust, perhaps, and different kind of challenges. Welcome
Fantastic.
to Sundsvall.
Lovely to be there. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I apologize. Would have loved to have been there.
We're so happy you can join us this way anyway. It's great. I mean, these days are about digitalization and the wonderful, great opportunities that we have thanks to all this new technical stuff. So we can meet all around the world. Okay, this is Indy Johar. Where are you right now? Are you in London or?
I'm currently in London. I'm just in the studios and I'm calling from London. So I would love to have been there, like I said. It would have been very good fun, but unfortunately we weren't just able to quite make it.
We're just getting ready the slides as well, Indy.
Perfect. So will I.
So, while we are getting ready, get ready with your Twitter and the hashtag Nordic Future or hashtag Nordic Future 17. Because the people that are watching on YouTube, hi guys again, they can actually see all the tweets as well while they are watching. So that's a good way to communicate with the people that are not here.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm going to just pull it up on my as well.
After we have been listening to Indy, we have some great young entrepreneurs who's going to be talking. Hi guys, Futura. We're really looking forward to this as well. And we will talk to Kevin Jones. And at the end of the day, we will have a panel from Silicon Valley here. And we have some people on stage. And we'll be trying to have sort of like a conversation between Silicon Valley and Sundsvall. So that will be really interesting as well. Right, Lars? Okay, this works. Oh, we can't see Indy now. I want to see Indy. Can we see both? No.
Can't see both? Okay, in which case I will.
We're just getting the slide ready. Inte se båda. Yeah. Okay. At least they have seen you now, Indy. Now they can only see the slides.
Perfect. In which
but
case
they know
what
you look like now. We know you are here with us.
Absolutely. Well, it makes it easier. I can't see the audience as well. So in a way, I think it's an interesting conversation to have. So firstly, I want to start by saying I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. I think we're in a very pivotal moment. I think a lot of the conversations that we're starting to have, I think in a really one of the few transition moments that we see in the nature of how we see the world and how change is going to occur. And I'm going to talk a little bit from our perspective of having been part of 00 nearly for 10 years and the work that we've done. And slowly off the back of it, we've been building a conversation. And so if I go to the next slide, you'll see a little bit about 00. And on that next slide, you see, we are quite an unusual organization that not only have many of us studied architecture, and off the back of that, we've also built OpenDesk, open source housing, all the way through to multiple impact hubs, through to WikiHouse, which is open source housing, open source furniture, and all the way through to part of the story of actually civic systems and how we drive change. Now, the thing we've been predominantly interested in, the next slide, sorry, has been the idea of how do we the power to create society. Often we talk about democracy in a way that's often reduced to the notion of the vote. Everyone talks about democracy as the vote and the democratization. But what we think is happening is increasingly is a radical democratization of how we create society, how many of us can work together to create society in a whole new format. And that's been the kind of predominant preoccupation of 00 in many, many formats. Next slide, please. And in a way, historically, you could argue, and we often have, that architecture has been a privilege and built environment has been a privilege for the 1%. How do you create architecture and environments for the 1%? And this is something that we've kind of often talked about. So if we go to the next slide, And what we see here is that, in a way, most of our economy, largely over the last, in a sense, since the Kaiser, with the kind of centralization of bureaucracy, has been a product of value creation, has been increasingly concentrated amongst the few. And that concentration of value amongst the few has been the method of how our economy has been organized. I think many people have talked about how that process is changing, how creation is increasingly becoming democratized, going from the few big to the many. And there's lots of good reasons for it. One, which is the complexity of the world that we live in, where it's very difficult for a centralized organization to predict and deal with the complexity and the divergence that we're seeing in many places. And in a sense, devolution agenda you've seen grow globally, and you could argue the Brexit is a kind of typical example of this kind of call for decentralization and distribution in some fashion. And that's to deal with complexity in ways that we've not been able to deal with. And at the same time, what we're seeing is actually, whilst we're looking at decentralization, we're also starting to, especially in architecture, how do we talk about system value? How do we talk about not just the construction value thing or the facility value of something, but actually the delivery value of something and the local economic multiplier? We know we have to increase the value proposition of most of what we build and take a systems view of that. Next slide. So, sorry, 2 slides. I think I've jumped to cities for the 99%. And I think one of the challenges that I want to bring to the table is, how do we create cities and environments for the 99%? I think the big challenge that we have is that our industrial economy was designed for 1% creating value and 99% being employed. And I think we're moving into a new economic model where 99% create value and have great contribution. And we need an environment in place which actually unlocks the capacity of the 99% as just the 1%. That's a fundamental transformation in the economic model that I think we'll be challenged by. If we go to the next slide. And some of our attempts over the last few years, you'll see one is the Wiki House, which Alistair Parvin and various others have co-founded. And what you see is kind of, if you go to the next slide, you'll see we've looked at how you can democratize the manufacture of housing and looked at the implication of fourth industrial revolution in terms of distribution, digital, and a kind of re-emergence of a digital craft economy. In a way, it looks quite similar to the pre-industrial economic model, where you can start to do decentralized models of manufacture in a way that we've never seen before. And if you go to the next slide, and in the next slide, hopefully what you'll see is actually a model which is moving, and this is effectively one of the kind of SketchUp models of the house, which you can vary, which you adjust, and it can be adjusted by people on their own laptops without necessarily a full need for an architect. And again, this is a means of democratization of design, but it's the fact that this can be printed locally and assembled, and this was put together in a couple of weeks with the whole housing format. And if you go to the next slide and the next slide after, 2 slides, you'll see a house which was put together, and it was fully put together and 3D printed on. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the cut pattern. So this is the cut pattern of the house on plywood, which is digitally cut out. Again, if we go to the next slide, you'll see some of and if you carry on going through the next slide and the next slide, and you'll see next the 3D model, which is effectively moving around, and you'll see it. This is effectively how you can vary the house, and people can change it in accordance to the needs and desires that they want. And so you can see how this democratization of not only the tools of design, but also the tools of manufacturing are creating a new reality. Next slide. Now you'll see hopefully open source window, and you'll see, so this is also going into the design of details and all the way through. And next slide again, all the way through to the smart control of a house. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm going to keep you busy.
This is really busy. Are you on smart controls now, or?
Yeah, exactly, smart controls.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and if we go to the next slide, you will see again. What's fascinating about there's a global community of people building, experimenting, and developing these houses. People in New Zealand who are doing extraordinary things about looking at earthquake-proof houses and so on. So, and if we go to the next slide again, and this has created a global community of probably one of the largest communities of R&D in terms of actually developing new housing models, and this has been growing all over the world. And next slide again. You see an example of a longhouse, but obviously this is not something new. So you go to the next slide and you see open source barn raising. So we've been historically building environments in this sort of format. Digital has accelerated the capacity for us to do this in ways that we've never perceived before. Now, next slide. We took the same format and adopted it to furniture, which is called Open Desk. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see hopefully a rather beautiful piece of furniture. And what you start to see is that this furniture is again printed using 3D routing and can be distributed around the world. And if you go to the next slide and the next slide, you'll see a map. This was effectively 4 weeks in. The distribution of people were downloading this furniture pretty much everywhere in the world, printing it, varying it, and sending copies of photographs of it around the world. It was #2 on Hacker News. Now, you start to see how this fundamentally changed the economy of distribution. Not only are now can you print an open desk within typically 7 miles, but usually within 7 days you get it delivered. So this new economy of radical distribution and democratization of innovation is, I think, changing the nature of how we produce and make and consume in radically different ways. Next slide. And you'll see some furniture that's been put together. And next slide. And you can see people, and next slide again, you'll hopefully see this is an incredible city, Knowles West, where a community, instead of buying furniture, set up a factory and printed furniture and started supplying people with furniture as well. So what you saw was they took what was a capital investment into buying furniture and turned it into a job creation engine of a local factory. And next slide, you see some sample furniture. And again, we've been developing this stuff around the world, doing lots of different things. And obviously, we've been part of the Impact Hub community, building numerous Impact Hubs and helping 2 social investment funds come to fruition, both in the UK and in India. Next slide. And again, next slide. And next slide. You'll see some pictures of Impact Hubs that we've built. Now, in a way, all of that talk, so if we get to the next slide, you'll see Beyond the Cult of the Magic Bullet. That's the, yeah. Are we there? To the Beyond the Cult, yeah.
Let's see. I'm on the Impact Hub Islington.
Yeah, if we keep going.
Impact Hub Birmingham.
Yeah, just keep going.
Keep going. Beyond the Cult of the Magic Bullet.
Okay, so that's the kind of stuff that we've done, right? There's just to say we've done lots of stuff and we've explored lots of stuff. But this is the conversation I really want to have. What have we learned? And I think what we've learned is that there's something else going on. In a way, till now, most of our thinking has been driven by what I would say is cause and effect. Like any solution, everyone says, well, what's the product? What's the minimum viable product? What's the intervention? Usually a singular intervention. We are obsessed by the idea that every problem has a single solution. And I think this has been locked into our thinking for many, many reasons. We go to the next slide. Yet, the reality is we live in a world with complex challenges. So the reality is that actually most of the problems we're facing aren't simple cause and effect solutions. So this is a car crash in India, and India has more road deaths per linear mile than anywhere else in the world. A friend of mine who I met, his friend passed away. He decided to move to India to say, I want to do something about this. He very quickly realized the first challenge was that people were not helping people in a road accident. Why? Because they were afraid of the police. So he drove a judicial ruling. After that, what he very quickly realized was even if they got to hospital, they weren't being treated because doctors were only being paid if they were insured. He very quickly realized off the back of that if he wanted to do something, what he would have to do is fundamentally change sort of how this was dealt with. So he lobbied government for insurance on all roads. So all toll roads automatically have health insurance, emergency health insurance on them. After that, he realized that ambulances turned up because it was insurance infrastructure. After that, he built the tech app. Now, I just give you an example of how a wicked problem has 5 or 6 different intervention points to drive change. Yet often as entrepreneurs and as problem solvers, we tend to be reductive to say the problem is this and the solution is a thing. Yet increasingly in a systems world, we're realizing this is not true. Next slide. And I think this is the crux of the challenge I want to put down. Most of our conceptual thinking for the last 200 to 300 years has been built on the idea of the object, the silo, the in vitro. In a way, the ability to isolate one thing from the next. This has been the center point of actually how we as a civilization in the West have grown, because what we've been able to do is say separate science from maths, chemistry from physics, and we've created in vitro. We've isolated one thing from the next to be able to understand it in vitro. Yet one of the big things that we've faced over the last 20 years is recognition of the interdependency between challenges. So our climate change challenge is not an isolatable challenge. Financial crisis that we faced in 2007, 2008 was not an isolatable crisis. It could be isolated to a single event, a single activity. We are now living in an age where the interdependency of things is large enough and significant enough that we can no longer choose to ignore it and imagine everything is in vitro and unisolatable. So one of the big challenges we face is that our mental model of the last 300 years, which was actually understand the world through isolation, so understand a thing, a business through its isolation, isolated balance sheet. Can business be understood through its balance sheet only? Well, maybe, maybe not. In an interdependent world, we have to understand it through its system value. So how do we start to live in a world which systems value and system risk are becoming much more transparent and visible and navigable, and actually the object value and discrete value is increasingly questioned? I think this is the center point of actually one of the big paradigm changes that we are facing. Now, in a way, one of the quick statements I often say is that good example of this, if you take a child born in the East and you show them a painting, they will describe the context first, and if you ask them again, they will describe the object. Whereas if you take the same painting and show it to a Western child, they will describe you the object at the center of the painting, typically the vase. And then if you ask them, they will then describe the context. I think we are in a perspectival paradigm shift, where context and our interdependency is fundamentally challenging how we see the world. We are living in a world which is post-sovereignty, the idea that you are sovereign. We are living in a world of massive interdependency. This illusion of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man is just that. He is not a product in isolatable context of the pure circle. He is a product in relation to context, both in space and time, and many other issues. His mind is not his head. His mind is a relationship with other people. My thoughts are not my own, but a product of relationships with other people. In terms of my physiology, we all know that physiologically I'm a product of epigenetic context. So in a world of interdependency, how do we start to actually do change is, I think, one of the fundamental questions we face. Next slide, please. Oops, nothing there. Have you got a blank slide?
No, it's white.
No, okay. If you trick it again, if you hit it again.
Yes, it's a circle now.
And then if you hit it again, and what you increasingly find is that these sort of situations manifest themselves everywhere. So if you look at issues of poverty, we increasingly know that poverty is not a product of a single point issue. Poverty is driven by multiple issues, whether it's sort of health, mental well-being, environmental context. We know these are system dependencies which cannot be isolatable to the individual. Next slide, please. And next slide. And if you just keep clicking, you'll see the things popping up. Yes. So again, if we take severe multiple disadvantage, poverty, offending, mental health, domestic abuse, substance abuse, unemployment, asylum, these things are interdependent. They cannot be isolated. How do you do change in this world? So what does the theory of change look like when actually any of these issues, increasingly we're seeing a massive rise of home abuse rising, as stress levels in the country rise. How do we deal with the level of change? How do we deal with these complex issues? Next slide, please. Now, I like this diagram, and what you see here is a diagram that was done by Joseph Heshu from the Academy of System Change. And why I like this diagram is this is a diagram about all the different drivers driving the decline of fish stock in an area. Now, why I think this is interesting is that we would often assume the solution was one thing or another. Here, you very quickly realize there are multiple factors driving the decline of fish stock, all the way from trust, gang violence, depletion of trust, and then fundamentally, there's multiple policy drivers, and then there's multiple actors influencing it, all the way from the pesticides that farmers use. So in a world where actually single issues are driven by, single outcomes are driven by multiple factorials, what does change look like? How do we organize change? I think is one of the most fundamental issues we face, because it goes counter to our methodology, or always imagining there's a magic bullet, one magic hero, one magic story that can resolve these complex issues. Next slide. This is again a diagram done by Alistair Parvin, which is again looking at housing, and I think you have the same problem in places like Norway, but and Stockholm, I know. So this is a housing, looking at the problem of rising house prices and disenfranchisement, and you very quickly realize that in many parts of the world we've not been able to deal with this issue, and the reality is because it's not a simple issue. It's not a single increase the supply, increase the demand, increase. It's a complex knot of problems where change cannot be affiliated by one single intervention, which is typically our modality of change. Next, please. Here, this is a piece of work done by the UK Cabinet Office looking at the drivers of obesity. And you see there are hundreds of factors, or at least certainly tens and tens of factors driving obesity. Yet often our debate is reductive onto the nature of sugar tax or a single issue. So the reason why I'm showing you these maps is not to say that this change is not possible. The reason why I'm showing you these maps is to effectively say that we need a new model of change. A change which actually recognizes there are multiple factorials driving the issues that we care about. If you think about educational attainment, we know schools are only one factor in educational attainment. Prenatal nutrition, postnatal nutrition, reading ages, 3-year-olds, there are whole after-school clubs. All these issues come together to drive educational attainment. Yet often we become reductive as to the single point issues behind them. Next slide. And this drives itself into well-being. So increasingly we think of, we often think of the consumer and the individual at the center of well-being. But we know in well-being terms, actually your well-being is a social product, because fundamentally your brain and your mental well-being is a product of actually your relationships. It's not just purely a mental personal exercise. We know that physically, as a human body, you're a body of multitudes. There are many, many organisms living inside you in symbiotic relationship with you to make you what you are and to make you healthy. We know that actually in epigenetic terms, as I was explaining earlier, we are a product of context and and multiple contexts. And then there's other aspects like a spiritual self. But increasingly, we often prescribe well-being issues to the individual. Yet actually we know these are relationship and relational issues. So how do we design for change in a world of relational well-being as opposed to individual well-being? And I think these are asking fundamental questions about, for example, we're doing a piece of work with the YMCA in the UK, reimagining the original first YMCA, which built the gym and various other things. And they're starting to say, how do we radically reimagine the gym, not for the individual, but for the relationship? Now, that's a fundamental twist of going from the individual to actually thinking about stuff in a fundamentally different way. Next question. Next slide, please. So the next slide, you again will see a rather complex diagram. This is a piece of work we're doing in Dubai, looking at actually the number of agencies involved in if you want to go and live and work in Dubai. This is the number of interaction points that are agencies involved. If we want to radically improve the outcome of how fast you can go and live and work in Dubai, you have to change actually maybe 40 to 50 agencies' processes. So if we want to talk about change, here it's not a single point change. Again, it's a multi-actor change model. And I think that's been one of the things that's become central to a lot of our thinking. Next slide. The second part of the question is the power of the oblique. Please do tell me how long I should speak for as well. So when people are getting bored as well.
I'll tell you.
So the next part of the question is, next part that I want to bring to the table is the power of the oblique. So, I mean, too often we think of stuff through very cause and effect linear models. Next slide. What you'll see in front of you is two women planting cabbages, carrots, onions, potatoes, spinach in every part of public realm in a town called Todmorden. Now, these two women, over the course of 7 years, have impacted depression, have impacted the rates of depression, have impacted the rates of unemployment, have impacted the rates of shop vacancies at the front door. Because what they invested in was planting in the public realm these places to carrots and cabbages, and they got lots and lots of people involved. And in that process, every once in a while, people come out and harvest the food. So what they invested in was bridging social capital in the town of Todmorden. And the implication of investing in bridging social capital was isolation issues reduced, new ventures being born, new reduction in unemployment, if not more issues. Now, who here would have said the best way to improve venturing in a town and reduce depression was not setting up a startup fund, but actually having people grow cabbages? Nobody, right? But we increasingly, over 7 years, have data that investing in the bridging social capital of places these unintended, non-linear consequences. Now, what's fascinating is not only do we know this, actually we have the data behind this, we can start to think and intervene in policy terms. So in policy terms, we often, if you sit in a room, if you were all policy people, I'm sure some of you are, you would always talk about this issue saying, if you wanted to drive economic development, you would say, let's set up a startup fund, set up an impact hub, or let's set up a co-working space. Who would ever think about actually growing cabbages? Now, when you have the data, we start to understand a whole new modality of how public goods and public value can be created, which is non-linear and non-simplistic. And I think this is important to bear in mind. Next slide, please. At the same time, what we're seeing is in a world where we don't have to buy activities, i.e., if you're not saying buying startups, but instead of saying we want you to invest in 20 startups, but actually investing in saying procuring not 20 startups being invested in, but actually saying we want more people to be employed and gainfully employed, you could start to procure. You can start to procure into somebody investing into cabbages being grown in public realm in a whole new way. And why I'm saying this is that we now have the architecture of procurement to deal with oblique outcomes. Now, I'm not advocating growing cabbages everywhere, but what I'm trying to show is that there's an oblique way of actually driving outcomes rather than the linear, predictable cause and effect way. And I think that's super important to recognize. Next slide, please. The next trend I want to talk about is the cult of the now. Now, please. Too often, a lot of our thinking has been limited to what I would say is crisis management. And what that means is that we often talk about prevention, investing for prevention, but very little money is actually invested into prevention. Most of it deals with crisis. And one of the big reasons for that is that actually largely to do with state accounting methods. Now, the diagram and the drawing you see behind you is something called Chicago urban blocks. This looked at effectively urban realm where $1 million was being costed to the state in reoffending costs. Now, if I was to tell you that in the US, reoffending cost $144,000 a year, $144,000 a year, And if I was to tell you that a prison warden once told me that if you can give the ages of children the age of 7, he can predict with 70% certainty which child will come to his prison. How do you do preventative investment in that case? And increasingly, what's interesting is things like social impact bonds have created the architecture of being able to invest into prevention and innovate into prevention. I think has been one of the key issues, and this is a really key issue. If you don't have the accounting architecture, which states don't, state budgets are largely cash-to-cash budgets. They don't look at 10-year liabilities or 20-year liabilities. They deal with effectively cash-to-cash budgets. On that case, it's very difficult to invest for preventative causes. So state largely becomes a welfare cost management exercise, rather than a future prevention and investment exercise. And that, I think, very quickly start to realize is we know that social impact bonds are the birth of a new accounting architecture, which allows for a new type of innovation into focusing around prevention. Next slide, please. And in a way, in the architecture of prevention, and what you see in front of you is what I would call as a Maslow's hierarchy of investment prevention. You can invest by hiding the problem, which is the minimum thing. You can invest by addressing the social costs. So, for example, somebody who's homeless costs the state $38,000 to $44,000. It is cheaper to give someone homeless a house than it is to actually keep them on the street, because the cost of A&E. But at the same time, what is the loss in the human capital contribution that they would have had if they were contributing to the state? And at the same time, if you were to look at the role of that investment, everyone in this room, and we're all privileged in many ways, if you look at actually, say, your health service and how that allows you all to behave differently. Many of you will not have used the health service today, but you all had the benefits of recognizing it's there. And we know stuff like health services also reduce corruption and other issues. So when you look at this full stack of value, you start to see prevention in a fundamentally multidimensional sense. It is not only the true cost of the individual, but actually the positive opportunity cost loss of the individual, as well as the cost on society and the value unlocked in society to behave differently. What does that business model look like when you look at welfare in that systematic human flourishing sense? I think is one of the key challenges to unlocking a different model of how we create value in the state. Next slide, please. And I think this is what one of the big challenges for me. In a complex and emergent world, democracy needs a new class of innovation. Massively coordinated, collaborative, and oblique around whole groups of agents and actors working together. I think our challenge is not about individual heroes anymore. Our challenge is to build movements of change, movements of multiple actors working together to drive change in a whole new way. We do not have the privilege or the horror or the different disciplines of being a China or an India, where there is centralized power and centralized authority. If we're going to preserve a democratic system, we have to build a theory of change and a model of change and a model of innovation which preserves multi-actor models of change. We cannot autocratically decide what change looks like, but build whole new models. Next slide, please. How many more minutes? Tell me.
Well, if you could take maximum 10 minutes.
Perfect.
Is that okay?
So, perfect. So, next part of this is, if we really talk about this in terms of remaking, I think one of the big questions we deal with is remaking the dark matter of tomorrow. Why do I talk about dark matter? Is increasingly what certainly a lot of my experience was showing was that there was a challenge behind the products and services. All of our institutional infrastructure has been built around the idea of centralized change, and also built around the idea of single models of change. Next slide. And yet the last 20 years, in a way, and last 10 years, have been all creating a new architecture. You've all been hearing stuff like systems change, which is actually this kind of model of multi-actor models of change. You've been hearing about social impact investment bonds, which are social impact bonds, which are actually new accounting architectures, which take account of future liabilities. You've been hearing about open data, which is about interoperability of data amongst multiple organizations, so creating the data infrastructure for systems change. And you've been talking about open making, which is actually about the stuff we were talking about, open manufacturing and other things, which is again about unlocking the system looking at the system balance sheet of a collective group, organizing and making together in different ways. These, I think, are fundamental trends in a new model of making our economy. Next step, please. What are we learning? Next step again. I think one of the big things what you're learning here is that actually one of the things I'm often critical of is that we often talk about impact investment and impact capital, but the reality is that impact investment has been relatively small. So in the UK, you've got the largest social impact investment fund in the world, which is set up by the UK government, which is Big Society Capital, which is 600 million. It's a fund of funds. But let's be really honest. The reality is that we buy £1 billion of ice cream a year. So 600 million is our size of our social impact fund. We buy £1 billion of ice cream a year. Our total welfare spend annually is about 400 billion. 400 billion. So we start to realize that the scale of impact funds to the scale of social challenges we face is fundamentally disproportionate. Now, what I'm sitting in front of you is bubblegum. So our national spend, our international spend on international development in its kind of through formal routes is about 26 billion. At the same time, our total bubblegum economy is about 26 billion. You see, in global terms, actually our economic questions and the scale of these funds are not in the right order. And I think one of the big challenges we face is how do we take this thinking into the mainstream? How do we actually scale it with the right scale and order, which I think is one of the big challenges we face. Next. So the provocation I have to the table is, how do we go from startups to systems, where you're talking about multiple actors and multiple, including a startup, but how do you drive change as through multiple modes of intervention rather than just a startup by itself? And again, we saw this. We're increasingly, whether you like Uber or not, Uber cannot do change by itself. It needs policy regulation, labor laws, other things to come into effect to create the institutional context for that sort of change. So we recognize change is going to have a systems order, and the startup is merely one actor in that process. So again, how do we start to look at this stuff is super important. Next. Here, I mean, this is a piece of work that we did around looking at the future of schools and decentralizing schools. And what you very quickly realize is that how do we design, and this was a piece of work that looked at actually designing not the object of a school, but actually the system of a school. This distributed a school all throughout a village and built a whole new soft network of schooling around it, as opposed to fixating on the object. So how do we think and design systems, not objects? Next slide. How do we not do master plans but build movements? How do we build movements of change in a place and a location, as opposed to recognizing everything as a master plan where you can predict the modalities of change? Next slide, please. I think the next slide is perhaps the most difficult, but I think one of the philosophical questions we need to start to have is, in a world of interdependency, where everyone is interdependent with everyone else, where is public and where is private? I'm increasingly frustrated with our debate around data because I think we are still trying to understand the world using 19th century language of public and private, when we live in a world of interdependency. And our language and our modalities of thinking about it have to be reframed to recognize interdependency. And whilst the fears of public and private data are real, but I think we have to resituate it in a whole new modality of thinking. And I think that is the scale of deep work that's required. So how do we go beyond these dichotomies of public and private? And I think we have to start to think again. Next. I already spoke about this, which is how do we go from buying activities to outcomes? And I think that allows for innovation in the process of what is drivable. And these sort of procuring tomorrow activities is really important. Next slide, please. Leadership. How do we have collaborative leadership? The work we were doing in Oslo very quickly realized that Oslo was a very interesting location because it had one of the largest numbers of women leaders who were naturally far more collaborative than the male ego, and I'm sorry to say this. And what we found was it was a much more collaborative environment for collaborative innovation. So we need a whole generation of leaders which are used to dealing with collaborative leadership in a whole new modality. Next change. What we also then very quickly realize is that collaborative change requires investment in building shared language, shared senses, intelligence, decision-making, wisdom through a system. When I was showing you those system diagrams, that wasn't about making you feel all godlike and so you could see the whole problem. Actually, the whole point of showing those systems and building those system diagrams is to build everyone's awareness, to come on, build everyone's shared language, awareness, and actionability. This isn't a new centralization by seeing the godlike view from the world. It is about building the collective intelligence of the group and collective agency of the group. That's a whole different modality of change in a new way. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, this slide is a bit dark, but what you'll see is that if you are taking this systems journey, you start to realize there's a hierarchy in this process. Step one is largely about recognition. Do you recognize the other actors who are contributing to the outcome you're working towards? Coordination, how do you coordinate? How do you collaborate, and what does synthesis look like? And increasingly we're seeing this in our work, that if you look at innovation across large groups of actors, there's a hierarchy and a process and a journey to change. Next slide, please. Here's a messy one. The reality is, in the sort of change we're looking at, there is a politics to change. If you want to change the kitchen in your office, or the cereal that you buy in your office, you will talk to the right people. Actually, all change has a politics. And I think we need to be very, very clear about how we build that politics for change. And that involves building open public conversations in a whole new way. And that's, I think, one of our big challenges. How do we build a politics of change? It is no longer reliant on politicians to give us the politics. We have to build the politics in the process of change in a whole new way. Next slide. And you see I'm going to skip a few slides because I know I'm running off over time. So you will see, come to the next slide, which is collaborative authoring. What does authorship look like when you've got thousands of actors contributing to innovation, as opposed to one or two and everyone executing? This is a piece of work that, again, Alistair Parvin did for mapping the kind of numbers of actors that contributed to the birth of the Wiki House. And you see this is just the first few years. How do you look at collaborative authorship? The recent paper that was proved Einstein's theory of relativity had 1,000 actors behind it, 1,000 authors. How do we do change when there's a movement of innovators as opposed to single actors? And I think we have to shift our ideology from this individual hero that we often focus on. Next slide, please. And I'll skip through. Next slide. And this goes all the way through. In a way, we're looking at a lot of work around how do you finance urban systems change, the future of urban regeneration, and looking at these sort of places where systems become a key actor. We're looking at new financial models for doing that. If people are interested, we can happily talk to them about that as well. And that fundamentally starts to reimagine, next slide, urban regeneration, because it starts to look at actually recognizing if you want to improve children's outcomes, you look at actually the quiet provision of workspace and desk space and bedrooms. That has impact on the outcome. How do you build a new financial model which isn't based on the cost of real estate, but actually the social collective outcomes of society fulfilling itself? Increasingly, that sort of stuff is possible, and that requires us building a new financial model for urban regeneration, which is the work that we've been doing. Next. And you'll see this. But fundamentally, all of this stuff is unlocking is that in order for us to build a decentralized distributed model of adding value, which is systems oriented, we have to actually create new models of assurance, new models of quality control, and new models of regulation, which allow for distribution. And this is the dark matter work that I think is fundamental to driving this change. Next slide. And how do you build accountability in a world where 50 different actors drive those change? Again, what does accountability and governance look like? Next slide. And I'm going to jump a few. If we go to the end, I want to summarize a little bit because I know I've run out of time. So I will.
Is that the overview methodology? Is that the one you want, or?
Yeah, I mean, let's go to powering democracy, which is near the end. So, what I want to put down on the table is that whilst there's important work to be done around products and innovation, I would argue that one of the big challenging pieces of work that's required. Have you found the slide? It's near the end.
Let's see. It was a bit slow here, so it's powering democracy. Is that the one you want?
Yeah. So what I want to put down into the room here today is that I think the big challenge we face is not the seduction of new products and services. I think we're looking at a more fundamental renewal of the dark matter of our society, the institutional infrastructure of our society. What does governance look like in an interdependent world? What does accountability look like in an interdependent world? What does regulation look like in a complex, non-linear, predictable world? How do we make regulation when we can't protect the outcomes? What does policy formation look like? How do you do assurance and provenance in complex, agile, just-in-time supply chains whilst preserving the decentralized capacity to innovate? How do you do contracting in a systems world? How do you invest for systems outcomes as opposed to product outcomes? Now, why I say this is that I think without doing this dark matter foundational work, we cannot change the nature of the products we build. Our products are currently siloed products, limited to silo interventions and silo externalities, which are uncapturable. I think the challenge for us as a civilization, and I say this at a European context level, is to actually do the foundational work. And my worry is that at a European level, I am struggling to see people investing into this foundational work. People are seduced by sexy front-end contexts of building a new app and a new front-end or a new product. But actually what's required for me is fundamentally rebuilding and recasting our institutional infrastructure for a 21st century systems interdependent world. That is the world we're moving into, and we need to build our institutional infrastructure. Let me be clear that the Industrial Revolution was not just the product of makers, it was also simultaneously the product of people building the British Standards Institute, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was being built at the same time. So new institutional infrastructures always go hand in hand with actually new technological revolutions. Currently, I have a fear that we are only focusing on the products because we are trying to compete by thinking we can make cool products without building the corresponding institutional infrastructure to allow for us to build the new revolution. And I think UK has and Europe has a fundamental advantage here. We are probably the last bastion of a functioning democracies left in the world. I think America can be discounted as a capital economy. Forgive my American friends over there, but in a way, I think there is an opportunity for us to build this new institutional infrastructure to preserve democracy. That is why I think I would put forward to the room, if we're going to build the new value creation for the 21st century, which is going to be radically decentralized, distributed and democratized, we have to build the policy and dark matter for that future. With that, I sincerely apologize for not being there, but I will conclude. Thank you. Next slide.
Thanks a lot, Indy. Can you hear the applause? Or let's see if I could see you.
Yeah.
It would be nice to see you. At least I had a picture of you there.
Yeah, I'll come up there.
Yeah, there you are. Now they can see you. Thank you so much. Well, this is really mind-challenging, and this is definitely something that we can continue talking about here during these 3 days in Sundsvall. One question that I have asked a lot of people here today, and they also talked about, is what drives you? I mean, you're doing a huge system change work in everything you do. What drives you doing this, Indy?
What fundamentally drives me is I think we are in a major I think we're the biggest transformation we've seen in the last 300 years. And I think the nature of our civilization is being recast. Trump, Brexit, all these things are phenomena of actually of a future that has been cast by another side. And I think we have to create and make the world that we want to live in. And I think the challenge is that democracy will not be built by just imagining us fighting in the streets. It will also have to be built by building the institutional infrastructure, which respects and puts humanity at the center of our economic model, and recognizes that every human being is more powerful than any AI that we've ever built. Any AI that a human being is more powerful than any AI that we've ever built, and will likely be for the next 40 years at least. And so when we start to think about the world that way, I think we're at a paradigm where we have to shift our institutional infrastructure. And if we don't, I fear that we are going to go to war. I think we're at that stage where I think we're setting the scenes for actually a massive global destructive pathway. So this is not just about, making money or losing money or some ideas. I think we are all part of a conversation which is much more foundational than that. And that's why I'm really honored to be part of the conversation that you guys are hosting, because I think this is the challenge that we all face. And I think this is foundational work, and build an economy that puts people at the center of it, and actually puts all people at the center of it, and builds a new model of equality, which the contribution of everyone is at the center of this future. I don't think we have a viable way forward. We can't get to Mars by two people getting to Mars. We have to take our whole civilization. And so the question is, how do we take everyone to Mars? And without that, there's no future. So I'm not sure if that's the answer to your question, but it's an answer.
Thank you so much. I actually found I want to applaud you again, of course. I actually found the quote on the internet, and it's basically the message you told us right now. Every human is a phenomenally powerful intelligence machine, yet we all treat them as bad robots who won't get it. So believe in us humans. That's the message.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Indy. Hope to meet
Absolute
you in real life.
Likewise.
And everyone is so happy that you spend some time together with us here.
My sincere apologies for not being there in person. Apologies to everyone, including Lars.
They're saying a big thank you here. You can't see them, but they are really, really happy you could be here with us this way at least. Okay, have a lovely afternoon now, and we will continue here co-creating the future inspired by you, Indy. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Real pleasure.
Thank you.